War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to episode 13, Airpower in World War II Case Study. After the horrifically wasteful folly of the Great War, later to be renamed World War I, the belligerent nations all sought to avoid a repeat, and all in very different ways. The Germans sought the tactical mobility to be found in mechanization to ensure this time Paris would be taken before the attacking force reached their culminating point. The French were determined to ensure the Germans could not penetrate their border through the impenetrable, but tragically avoidable, Maginot Defense Line. The British were going to defend their island and punish their attackers, but not through leaving their shores. The Italians were going to ensure the Germans did most of the fighting, while the Italian Air Force would control the Mediterranean Sea, or as the Proto-Italian Romans called it, Mare Nostrum, literally, our sea. The Americans were going to not bother fighting at all, protected by their Navy and their Army Air Force's strategic bombing capability. Speaking of the Americans, this is not a history of air power in World War II. To do so in 15 minutes would be impossible. The U.S. Army Air Forces exhaustively cataloged over 300 volumes worth of post-war justification how they won the war in Japan and in Europe through air power alone. Noteworthy that they did not credit the atomic bombs for the ultimate defeat of Japan. Rather, the bombs somehow merely hastened the inevitable end brought about by, you guessed it, Army Air Force's strategic bombing. Rather, this will provide a case study of how different countries projected their own vulnerabilities on their enemies, and, frankly, everyone got it wrong until Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That air power, despite seemingly a brother to sea power, actually has very little in common, aside from both being reliant on technology to even exist in the domain. That sea power is a clash of technology in the operational domain, and that actual air power, not merely airplanes or air support, is a psychological weapon, which requires far more of the soft sciences than engineering to be properly wielded, and which is why we so often fail in its use, despite our almost inconceivable overwhelming superiority against all our foes. The pre-war 1930s was a time of both incredible financial hardship due to the Great Depression, as well as rapidly advancing aviation technology. So it was nearly impossible for nations to develop an air force with the requisite mass to successfully both gain and exploit command of the air. Some nations had lots of aircraft, but nearly all obsolete and easy prey to more advanced fighters, the Soviet Union being the primary example. Few nations had a strategic bombing capability. The United States alone prioritized 4-engine heavy bombers prior to the war. Many concepts of the new air warfare were tested during the Spanish Civil War, with both future Allies and Axis powers contributing air forces to the Republican and Nationalist sides, respectively. Germany's Condor Legion came away with many lessons, primarily focused on tactical air support and the difficulty of hitting tactical targets with aircraft. The Germans fully appreciated the tactical advantages given by air supremacy, or at least air control over the battlefield. But they neglected to take the recommendations of Douhet as to how to exploit the command of the air. Douhet focused heavily both on the need to target civilian populations and their morale, as well as the necessity of using poison gas to generate the requisite terror required for successful political capitulation. So Germany may have rejected the strategic bombing portion of the Douhet duality for two possible reasons. First, Hitler may have determined, and perhaps correctly in hindsight, that in the absence of the use of poison gas, no amount of strategic bombing would be decisive, and to sacrifice the mechanization of the ground forces or the tactical aircraft required to support them would be a waste of money. And Hitler's aversion to the use of poison gas, except when it came to the Jews, ensured that his victory would be gained on the ground. Second, Hitler may have projected his disregard for the well-being of German civilians onto the Allies. In other words, No matter how many civilians were killed by bombardment from the air or otherwise, the political center of gravity, Hitler himself, would remain intact, and therefore rendering strategic bombing a waste. He may have simply thought that the Allies would be similarly immune from the suffering of their people. Duhay, having died in 1930, would probably have strenuously disagreed with the makeup of the Italian Air Force leading up to World War II, as they, too, prioritized the tactical side of aircraft development and procurement and largely ignored the bomber portion. The British had some balance, with twin-engine bombers with some range and slightly greater payload, and of course their Spitfire and Hurricane fighters. But even this balance betrays a commitment to one or the other. They didn't have enough bombers to truly effect a strategic bombing campaign, but likewise lacked the fighter capability to dominate the skies. They effectively neglected any aspect of tactical air support to ground forces early in the war. The British heavies, the four-engined Avro, Lancaster, Halifax, and less capable Stirling, came well after the Battle of Britain was over. The twin-engine Vickers Wellington, which provided the bulk of the British bombing capability early in the war, had but 15% of the payload capability of the four-engine heavies. Hugh Trenchard had provided the intellectual basis for British air power, but the division of the independent Royal Air Force into 4 sections neglected his Duhay mimicking concepts. The commander of British Bombing Command, Arthur, aptly nicknamed Bomber Harris, was a true believer who was incensed that the Allies would have the temerity to even plan an invasion of Western Europe. He just needed a few more giant raids on various cities to force the Nazis to surrender. Of note, nearly 50% of the men assigned to his command as aviators were killed in action. The American Army Air Corps, renamed to the Army Air Force just prior to our joining the war in June of 1941, had focus. They were betting heavy, pardon the expression, on the B-17 Flying Fortress. And despite their external pronouncements that anti-shipping and precision daylight bombing was the purpose, internally were focused on a very Duhay-esque total victory through air power. They knew air power required bombing civilian targets. But they also knew that the American Congress, many somehow still upset over Sherman's march to the sea during the American Civil War, would never support an explicit strategy of targeting civilians to force political surrender. So they created an operational concept of pinpoint daylight bombing that would target the industrial might, one of Duhay's other less decisive targets, without unduly harming the surrounding civilian populations. They spent billions of real 1930s and 40s dollars on developing the Norden bomb sight to effect this required accuracy. It cannot be emphasized enough that this was, initially, a purely political fig leaf to justify heavy bombers during the austerity of the 1930s economic environment. But having justified it for several years, they committed to it for years during World War II, even though it was not intended to be the actual strategy. The harm of this commitment was immense. 26,000 airmen assigned to the 8th Air Force, the primary bomber command in Europe, were killed. Its overall strength was over 200,000 men, more than the entire Allied invasion force on D-Day. The Army Air Force consumed 2.7 million men at its peak in 1945 with 80,000 aircraft. They intended to win the war by themselves. Hap Arnold, the father of the Army Air Force and later Air Force, was dedicated only to his Air Force and its perception of supremacy, not in the air, but in the halls of the newly built Pentagon. In this, he was successful. The irony is while the Army Air Force was committed to victory independent of the other services, it constantly shifted its targeting focus, from oil production to aircraft manufacturing, to submarine pens, none of which would change Hitler's mind or force his surrender. The focus on destroying Germany's aircraft manufacturing was a twofold failure. 1. The Flying Fortress was built to not worry about the enemy's tactical air force, bristling with self-defense guns, and 2, at the peak of the Air Force's campaign, Germany's output of aircraft continually increased. Finally, the mighty 8th was relegated to targeting transportation networks in France, in shaping the battlefield for the inevitable invasion of Europe by ground forces, which the leadership of the Army Air Force had insisted for years would be unnecessary. But the commander of the 8th Air Force, up until just before Normandy, Ira Eaker, said in 1943, "We must never allow the record of this war to convict us of throwing the strategic bomber at the man in the street. But that is what strategic bombing is ultimately about. The Air Force had lost the ends, having focused so tirelessly on their very expensive ways. Of course, despite their protestations to the contrary, ultimately throwing the strategic bomber at the man in the street is exactly what the B-17s and B-24s and B-29s ended up doing. Now, lest you think I'm being unduly harsh on the American Air Forces, the German Luftwaffe suffered a converse failure. They had a determined end, command of the air, but they never developed the means to achieve it. In the Battle of Britain, a proposed precursor to the Nazi invasion of the British Isles, codenamed Sea Lion, the Germans sought to gain sea control in the English Channel. The naval forces could only accomplish this with air supremacy. Goering, the Reichsmarschall in command of the Luftwaffe, ensured Hitler this could be done. Wisely, he started on attacking the aircraft manufacturing capabilities on England, which were initially located close to the eastern coast and accessible by German fighters based in France. However, the Germans never invested in long-range fighters or bombers. The English were more than capable of moving their manufacturing farther west and out of range. In fact, the British were never short of fighters, only men to fly them. And flying over their home territory, they could crash land or parachute out and be in a new aircraft the same day. The Germans could not. These roles were later reversed in the war, with German airmen fighting on home turf and Allied airmen flying over enemy territory. So this is a lot of very abbreviated history to get to the ultimate point of the case study. The political center of gravity for the Nazis was Hitler himself. The strategic center of gravity was their ground forces. The British and American strategic air forces could target neither of these. Therefore, they were of no strategic value. This is not to discount their operational and tactical value, but the investment was made to deliver a war-winning capability, not a support function to the actual decisive victory in Europe, the ground invasions from Russia and France. The investment made in what was ultimately a shaping operation was far greater than the benefit derived. The juice the Air Force delivered was paltry to the immense squeeze they demanded. If evaluated from an ends, ways, and means perspective, the nation understood the ends, the capitulation of the Nazi regime. The means was rock solid in the Air Force's focus, the heavy bomber. But the ways escaped them, because there was no linkage between means and ends. For the Air Force, the ends were always the acquisition of a strategic bombing force and independence from the Army and Navy. The various justifications they disguised as ways to acquire these ends were political tactics and information policies only. Airpower theory demanded the admittedly unsavory targeting of civilian populations with overwhelming force, a fact Mitchell eventually accepted as gospel. But in Washington, D.C., that wouldn't, pardon the expression, fly. So harnessing the information and diplomatic levers of power, they created the politically palatable precision daylight bombing justification to acquire their ends, which worked for the Air Force, but ultimately failed the nation. On the Allied side, the will of the British people were the political center of gravity. Churchill replaced Chamberlain due to his failures politically to motivate and lead the British people. Had the Germans invested in heavy four-engine bombers to enact attacks on Britain at the same scale and devastation that the Allied air forces inflicted on Germany, they would probably have forced Britain out of the war, and with it, the ability to effectively wage the decisive ground campaign in Europe. Stalin's ability to withstand and much less defeat a unified Wehrmacht in a single front and without the basing and staging of naval escorts from English territory is questionable. So while the tactical air forces, which were the focus of German air planning and procurement, supported the German strategic center of gravity effectively, they were not capable of providing air power, merely air superiority at key points on the battlefield. Never strategic, they could never provide a strategic outcome. The British could never withstand the strategic bombing that the Germans were subjected to. They were sensitive to civilian casualties in a way the fascist powers were not. But instead of focusing on their enemy, the Allies projected their own strategic vulnerabilities onto the enemy, showing a lack of cultural empathy which was wasteful and prolonged an already brutal war. Likewise, Hitler, while disdainful of democracies and the weak-willed populations which ruled them, failed to account for how this could be worked to his advantage. In the end, Hitler was limited to land power in his thinking, and his trust in Goering was misguided. Goering was an accomplished and brave fighter pilot, but he was not a man who understood air power. Had either of them really read Duhay, or Trenchard, or Mitchell, their procurement priorities and the outcome of the war might have been far different. These failures can be transferred to the Pacific theater, but with one key difference: the atomic bomb. Remember, Duhay advocated for the use of chemical weapons to maximize not only deaths, but fear in the heart of the enemy's populations. The inexplicable, to the Japanese at least, destruction wrought by a single bomb twice used was enough to convince the Japanese emperor to finally abandon his generals and save his people from what he must have assumed was imminent, complete annihilation. These weren't the deadliest attacks. Far more were killed in firebombing Tokyo, but it was the psychological shock of the unknown and the even more terrifying unknown future that ended the war. Ultimately, strategic air power is a psychological weapon. The effects of the bombing themselves are never decisive. Rather, it is the implied future effects that truly bring victory through air power, unless completely dedicated to a Carthaginian-esque genocide of your enemy's people, a subject which segues quite nicely to next week's topic, nuclear deterrence. Thanks for joining us today. If you liked what you heard, please like, subscribe, rate, and comment. Most importantly, share with your friends. Join the conversation at the War 102 subreddit, and check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for links to more information and supporting videos. Send me an email at war102podcast@gmail.com. I look forward to your comments and hope you join us again next week. See you then.